foot skid mark. We can look at the video and we can see that the blue Honda landed parallel with the trooper's car. And we can see that Josh shot right around it. What do you do in that situation? You're on 90. It's a busy day. Guy slams on his brakes. By all accounts, these brakes take 190 feet to take you from the point where you're going the speed limit to the point that you're stopped, 190 feet. For the prosecution to suggest you should just hit the magic brake and stop the car, it doesn't work that way.
Those were some of the closing arguments in the Joshua Gaspar trial out of Cleveland, Ohio last week. In case you missed it, it was an acquittal on the most serious charges that defendant faced across the board. The jury ultimately did convict the defendant on a few misdemeanor counts related to driving with an invalid license. We're pleased to welcome defense attorney Jon Sinn to the LawNewz Network now. He was the attorney for Joshua Gaspar in that case. Attorney, welcome to the LawNewz Network.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So this was a case that attracted a lot of attention in Ohio, and we broadcast it on a national level. Your reaction to the verdict?
Relief. It was a fantastic verdict. We took a long time to get this case to trial. There were a lot of pressure, as you can imagine, with the dead state trooper, but it was a lot of relief to finally get this one done.
I can't imagine the pressure because it's a case that everyone's going to pay attention to locally. I mean, no one, and I'm assuming yourself included, no one is happy when a member of the law enforcement community loses his or her life in the line of duty, and that's ultimately what happened here. But the one thing that struck me in this case is just a question of what level of culpability would attach to the person who was behind the wheel. And for those just joining us who perhaps didn't watch the trial in full, the accusation was that your client, Joshua Gaspar, was at a methadone treatment, and 14 minutes later, people start slamming on the brakes ahead of him on the highway. He swerves to try to get out of the way, goes into this berm, the left-hand shoulder of the road, and winds up striking this state trooper, causing his death right there on the side of the highway. So just a horrible case, but a question for the jury as to what level of culpability would attach to the client. And in this case, at least from my perspective sitting here, I thought the state's case was pretty weak. I'm certainly sure that you agree with me because that's how the jury came out in its finding. But these were some really tough charges.
Yeah, they really were tough charges, and I think it just got started off on the wrong foot when the trooper's friends actually did the investigation. And I don't say that lightly. For whatever reason, the State Patrol chose to keep this investigation, and they could have given it off to Cleveland, and they could have given it off to maybe the Attorney General's office. But by keeping it, we actually had friends that had worked with him for years making decisions on how to go with the investigation and whether to arrest my client. And I think that just led them down a path where they brought charges that they couldn't support. It was a difficult situation. It is a tragedy that the trooper's dead. There's just no way around it. There was a lot of outpouring in the community. The highway was renamed after the trooper. There was a parade. There was a televised funeral. So it was a lot of community support, and not so much for my client. He was pretty much labeled a cop killer from day one. The prosecutors kind of let out some information that he was either on drugs or drunk, and they also let out some information that he'd been speeding, and ultimately they couldn't support either one of those. But it took 11 months before we could get his side of it out.
Well, let's back things up a little bit and just talk about your role in this thing. When did you become this defendant's attorney?
He hired me about a week after this happened. I got a call from the family right away. I didn't know these folks. They were looking for an attorney from outside of Cleveland. If you know the Ohio area, I'm from Akron, which is about a half hour south of Cleveland. They didn't want to go with the local guy because they had some concerns about it being a police officer, and I don't know if nobody wanted to touch the case or what it was, but ultimately they came to me and I got involved right away. I tried to get involved with the media right away. I actually probably got it within a week. And within a week, I'd had a letter from my client's doctor indicating that methadone wasn't a drug of impairment, and I tried to release that. I did release that to the press, and that tended to get a lot of air on the news. And I was trying to kind of turn it around a little bit because the community was so convinced that he was high. And when they heard this methadone, I'm not sure whether the community thinks methamphetamine or what they think, but the reality is my client was on a therapeutic dose of methadone, meaning his doctor gives it to him every day. And, we had testimony that would not impair him. And in fact, it didn't impair him. But it was really hard to get that out in the press and get that out in the public. And I kind of felt like I was fighting this case in the public for 11 months.
I would assume that you've been in this position before as a criminal defense attorney where you have people just really piling on top of your client and you're one of the only friends he has.
Yeah, it was very unfortunate. It was very difficult to get a judge to listen to me about his bond. His bond started off as $100,000. Ultimately, we got it down to $50,000. Whenever we go to court for a hearing, the trooper's family would be there, and they're wonderful people, I'm sure, but they put a lot of pressure on the state to keep the pressure on my client. And we were unable to really get any type of plea negotiations going or anything like that. This case was going to trial from the minute they made the arrest, I think.
Have you ever seen a case in Ohio that you've handled or perhaps that friends have handled where there were just this many charges thrown at someone? It surprised me when I saw there was a 2016 indictment with 3 charges and then all of a sudden there are 10 more charges the next year. They threw everything possible at your client.
They did, and they were doing things behind the scenes that show you the real full power of the state government. I told you my client's doctor went ahead and wrote a note for me, a letter that basically said that he wasn't impaired at the time of the accident. They got that doctor fired right away. They made some allegations against the doctor of HIPAA and this and that, and the clinic didn't want any type of publicity, so they made sure they got the doctor in trouble with the state medical board, and they made sure they got him removed from his position. He stood by his patient. He came and testified for me, but I felt bad for that. They also went back and they dug into my client's driver's license application in Ohio from a few years before, and they found something that he didn't reveal, namely an out-of-state suspension, and they took his license away from him retroactively. Then they went back and they used that retroactive license suspension to add a spec onto these charges, which would have put an additional 5 years in prison on my client had he been found guilty. So, they were working real hard to get the full pound of flesh out of him.
It certainly seems that way. Now, a couple of things really concerned me about the way that the prosecution handled the case. One was this constant change in the speed at which your client was driving. The initial reports all said he was going 78 and a 60, and at trial, they eventually whittled it down and said it was probably somewhere between 62 and 65. And I kept sitting here saying, well, wait a minute. 62 to 65 and a 60 is staying with the flow of traffic. I mean, yeah, in theory, it's speeding a couple miles an hour over the speed limit, but that's within what many juries would look at and say that's an acceptable zone of deviation plus or minus the actual speed limit. How did this thing go from going 78 and a 60 to going 62 and a 60?
I think that particular night, or the day this happened, they had to put charges on my client. And so they put these charges on when they heard the methadone, even though he didn't look bad on the field sobriety test. They figured they'd get a blood draw, and whatever came out of the blood draw and the urine draw would be heavy-duty drugs, and then they'd have him. So they took this blood draw and they took this urine draw after they arrested him real quick. They got in a car and ran that up to the lab instead of mailing it, and they got the results back, and those results weren't what they thought they were going to be. Then they went ahead and they started talking about the speed, and they put that out in the press, 78 miles an hour, and they let that go for a while. And ultimately, an accident reconstructionist, their own, came out and said 62 to 65. That was one of the reasons I called this prosecution a little mean-spirited. I understood in the beginning the desire to hold someone accountable, especially if they are speeding or they are high. But when it came out that my client wasn't those things, which it did come out well in advance of trial, I thought the prosecutors had an obligation to back down, and they didn't. They just went at it full force. And by the time they were done, they were reaching so far. They were talking about Monster energy drinks and causing impairment and things. And I think they just overreached, and the jury sensed that.
Yeah. Okay. So where did the whole 78 mile an hour speed limit estimate come from? Is it just a number that came out of thin air, or did they think that they had some evidence that they could go forward and release that number?
They had various folks who were on the roadway at the time, just eyewitnesses, other drivers. And as you can imagine with eyewitness testimony, it's all over the place. In this particular case, it was really interesting to see how poor eyewitness testimony actually is, because I'd put these drivers on the stand and I'd cross them and I'd talk about their position and where they were, and then we'd show them the video from the trooper's car. And 9 times out of 10, these drivers who thought they knew where they were and what lane they were in and when things happened had it completely backwards. My point is, some of these drivers said that the cars were flying. Some of the drivers said it looked like my car was racing another car. They really just pulled a lot of stuff out the air, but in the end, they couldn't back any of it up. And I really thought that the state erred in putting that information out there before they talked to their own accident reconstruction people.
Well, I mean, that would seem to me that it would at least potentially trigger some kind of an ethical issue.
Yeah, I get where they're coming from. The trooper has a lot of support and a lot of family, and towards the end of this thing, I got the vibe that that's why they were going through all this. They were just going through the motions because, there's a family out there suffering and there's law enforcement that wants them to do these things. But this was a case that I'm glad it went to trial, but ultimately it might have been resolvable. You hate to plead out a guy to something you hate to plead him guilty to something when he's ultimately found not guilty. But we could have talked about plea negotiations, but the state was set on prison the entire time. And, prison was a non-starter for my client because he really felt that he'd done nothing wrong. And it's interesting to note that originally they only charged him with the vehicular homicide by way of impairment and then vehicular homicide by reckless. I asked for the lesser included offense of negligent homicide, thinking, well, the jury will surely find him at fault for some part of this accident, and they didn't. He was completely acquitted on all charges related to causation for the accident. So you never know what a jury's going to do.
That did surprise me that there wasn't, at least a bite from the jury on the lesser included. But, let me get back to some of the state's evidence at trial here. I was waiting for the state to call some independent expert on methadone to try to say, yes, there is some evidence that this stuff causes impairment. But the only thing that I saw that really even went in that direction was the state's attempt to impeach your client's own doctor on a few studies that I think they pulled out of Europe or something like that. So I didn't feel like the state even was able to carry the burden of proving that part of its own charge. Where was the state's own expert? If they're going to say that, why don't they have an expert on the stand that can back it up?
It's the strangest thing, because they had 11 months to find an expert, and I thought perhaps they could find an expert on anything, but they never put an expert report in. They never presented an expert, and then they brought my client's doctor on, as you said. Now, I had a toxicologist and a pharmacist that was going to come in and testify that methadone's not a drug of impairment. But all of a sudden, they were trying to bring in this new doctor from a local university, Case Western, that was going to counter that, and they could only get him in on rebuttal. So I chose not to put my own expert on because I thought, my guy's doctor did a nice job. I left that expert off that would have really nailed the coffin shut that methadone doesn't impair, because all of a sudden an expert shows up for them. But where this guy was the whole time, I have no idea. It seemed like a real strategic error on their part not to present expert testimony if they could get it. And it looks like they could get it. They just didn't put it in their case in chief.
Well, if the studies are sort of all over the place, part of me wonders if such an expert is even out there. That's one thought in my head. But, the other bizarre piece of this is that ultimately one of our analysts here, Ken Belkin, said it was a trial about methadone, which presumably your criminal courts there in Ohio are using as a treatment to more serious drugs of addiction. So it presents a weird position for a prosecutor, your opponent, to say this is a drug that causes all these problems, but I'm assuming at least that the same prosecutor or the same prosecutor's office, or at least other prosecutors in that state, are pushing people towards that direction as part of a treatment regimen.
Absolutely. Ohio is ground zero for the heroin epidemic, and although my client's addiction was pain pills, they're all opiates, and these methadone clinics, these Suboxone clinics, they work. That a lot of folks disagree with them. I think if you heard the nurse testify that they actually brought in to counter the doctor's testimony, which I thought was funny, the nurse countered the doctor, she's not a fan of methadone. Well, it does kind of replace one drug that impairs you with one that doesn't, but you're on it for the rest of your life. but it's probably better than folks dropping dead all over, and that's what's happening in Ohio and all across the country. So, yeah, the courts are using these services, and this place was called Community Action for Addiction, or Community Action for Addiction Network, and it's just a methadone clinic, and you drive in every day, and they give you a dose that you take, and they control the dosage, and you drive out and you go about your business. And my client was on it for about 2 years, and ultimately when he went to jail, he just weaned off it, and he's off it now. But apparently it's productive stuff, and the state's going to have to make a decision whether they want to use this kind of resource or whether they're going to dirty it up. And Cuyahoga County dirtied it up. I think if you're on methadone and you heard about this case, it would definitely give you cause to be concerned.
So where does the state go from here? I know that one of the questions you asked one of the troopers on the stand was, what has your agency done to combat this big, huge methadone issue that you're up here complaining about? And the answer was nothing. I thought that was a telling question and a telling answer.
Yeah, there is nothing. I got into the investigation, and some things that they ran by me late in the game were some of the activities that the Highway Patrol took to try and attack methadone clinics after this officer's death. So they had some meetings with some legislatures, and they had some other things they tried to do, but it's my understanding they got shot down. Everybody just told them, we're sorry about the trooper's death, but it's an accident, and methadone is a drug of treatment, and you're not going to change that. So they tried, but it didn't get very far. I still think there's a lot of folks out there in the Highway Patrol that are going to be bitter about this, and I think that they are still out there thinking that somehow, methadone caused this accident, when in reality, there's a lot of different things that caused it. It might be the guy who slammed on the brakes in front of my client. And you hate to say this, and it was difficult to bring up in trial, but the trooper's position in the road and being outside the car, that wasn't very safe. So, that was a difficult situation to approach at trial, but it did have to be said. And I think ultimately a lot of folks thought that's just not a safe practice, having troopers outside their car on a busy roadway like that. It just doesn't make sense. And they changed their policy now, the Highway Patrol has, where they're requiring the troopers to wear orange vests, but I don't think that addresses the problem. So hope no one else gets hurt.
We talked about this here at LawNewz as well, and I've lived in states in the Midwest where I've seen Highway Patrol officers literally standing on the dotted lines in between the multiple lines of traffic on an interstate highway doing this. Now, here in the Northeast, where I grew up and now once again live, we never see speed patrol done that way. Never. Because it just seems so inherently dangerous.
And I've talked to I tried to find the rules and regulations for the Highway Patrol about that kind of enforcement, and it's really, they don't document it. There's no rule against it. I've talked to young troopers who say they don't do it. It's an old school technique, and it's real dangerous. It is real dangerous, and they shouldn't do it. But they're still out there. They're still out there doing it that way, and I think it just lends itself to accidents. I think maybe these guys get too comfortable out there, and in this particular situation, guy didn't know how to respond to the guy in front of my client didn't know how to respond to the trooper's hand signal, didn't know what he was trying to tell him, and he locked up his brakes. And that was a perfect storm that caused my client to end up hitting the trooper. So it's just bad policy, I think, to try and surprise people by having a cop stand on the side of the road to get them. There's better ways to do that. People tend to freak out, and that's what happened in this case.
What happens to your client from here?
Well, he won all the felonies, but he had a series of misdemeanors, and basically, had he testified, we probably would have been able to handle those misdemeanors, but we didn't have him testify for a lot of reasons. One, that we were winning, we didn't want him to testify, but he's got some misdemeanors, and the judge could theoretically run them all consecutively and give him up to 18 months. He's already got 5 months in the jail. In Ohio, a misdemeanor carries 6 months in the county jail, not prison. So I think ultimately the judge will give him a 6-month sentence with credit for time served and let him out. But I don't know for sure. I'm hopeful. As to those driving charges, the reality is my client came to Ohio, had a suspension in Alabama that would have been up, never paid the reinstatement fee, and Ohio told him what he had to do to get a license, and he got it. And turns out, had he paid the $300 that Ohio told him he didn't need to pay, he wouldn't have been in that situation. And that license suspension spec added a whole lot to this case, because had my client lost this case, he'd have done about 15 years. So it was real serious.
Yeah, no, I mean, I went through the charges on the second indictment and started running the math and just said, okay, we're using that to add up to a first-degree felony here.
Yeah, and and I can't say enough about the judge. I'd never worked with him before. Really a fair guy. Really gave me a chance to try my case. Really focused on the right issues. But any judge is going to set you. If you hit a trooper, you're going to prison. I can't imagine a judge that wouldn't send somebody to prison for this. So there was no opportunity to go around the prosecutor and try and work this case out. Prison was always on the table, and they were always talking about a lot of time. So in the end, I'm glad we got where we got to.
Let's talk about burden of proof a little bit, because a lot of the debate can go back and forth and say, well, did the methadone cause an impairment? Did it not cause an impairment? Even if you're on the fence, that's not enough under the American standard of burden of proof resting on the state.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately the jurors, and I talked to two of them, it came down to burden of proof. They felt that the state didn't prove it, and they also felt that it could have been any one of them in that situation. I did a good job in voir dire of trying to get out there that their job as jurors is not to look for evidence of guilt, but it's to look for evidence of reasonable doubt. And this jury seemed to accept that, and ultimately it came back in our favor. But in talking to the jurors, they didn't have the problems with the charges I thought they were going to have. A lot of them were concerned that this could have happened to anybody. If you're out there and you take prescription medications and you hit a cop, they're going to come down on you.
I know that some members of Trooper Velez's family were in our chat rooms here at LawNewz. You said that they attended the trial regularly. Certainly just a horrible circumstance for them. Do you or your client have any message for them?
We've been on local news, and every news broadcast we've done, I've started out, my client's currently in jail, but I've started out sending condolences out to the trooper's family. This is a no-win situation. It really is a terrible tragedy. But we didn't have to go through all this. This was an accident. My client's insured. My client will take responsibility for the accident. I felt terrible having those people there every day. I mean, we had the trooper's brothers, and we had the trooper's son, and we had the trooper's mother, and these are good people. And they just had to stand there and watch that case fall apart. And I really don't think they had to go through all that. So it's uncomfortable, and for my part in it, I apologize for what we had to do, but ultimately, I don't think the trooper would have wanted an innocent man to go to prison, and I stand by that.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. Just a horrible circumstance all the way around, but you're a defense attorney, you're used to being in the hot seat, and you're probably used to a career that requires you not necessarily to take the side that public opinion is on, at least in the beginning of a case. So you're probably used to it.
I'm used to it. I've had some unpopular cases, and most defense attorneys have, but this one is unique because, there's a lot of folks who are pro-police out there that didn't know much about this case, and when they come after you, they come after you hard. They get on your Facebook, and they send you nasty messages, and I'm not popular all across the country now because I keep getting messages from folks who tell me, what a terrible thing I did. But a lot of folks have bad information too. They still think Josh ran from the scene. He didn't. They still think he was drunk or on drugs that day. He wasn't. And you're just going to have to let the system work, I guess.
Well, you bring up an issue here. I sit here as a journalist with a law degree, and my whole career has been trying to correct bad information out there. I do the best I can with it, but sometimes I just have to dismiss it if people don't want to believe the facts that I can present. So, maybe you're stuck in that situation as well. So any words for the prosecutor in this case? Do you think that they went too far? Do you think they should have backed off? Do you think they should have dismissed more of the charges before the jury got the case? How was your relationship with them?
There were three prosecutors in there, and I got along fine with them. They were professional folks, but I don't know. It's a difficult situation. I got a feeling that maybe they just said this is one of those cases that has to go to trial. We'd rather a jury throw it out than tell these folks that they don't have the case that they thought they had. So, but they didn't act like that. They act like they were going to win the whole time. The entire time they were going for broke, and when they started getting a little mean at the end, I didn't find that appropriate. I understand some cases have to be tried, but if we're all in there looking for the truth, I didn't feel they were trying to get to the truth. So maybe this will be a lesson to them not to bring charges they can't support in the future.
Well, I mean,
But
the model rules of ethics for attorneys, for prosecutors, are that they've got to push a case if they think that they've at least got probable cause. So, you know, I understand that that's a lower standard than actually winning a trial, but, you know, there's a degree of prosecutorial ethics that I'm always thinking about when I see things go like this.
Well, you know, and I'm putting this one behind me, and I don't really have a problem with those prosecutors. I'm never going to work with them again. I don't really work up in that area so much, but I'm not going to say that what they did was you know, unethical, but I definitely thought it was a little bit mean-spirited, and you know, I'm hoping they take something away from this, because in the end, the jury slapped them down, and the jury came back very clearly. When the jury found my client not responsible for the accident at all, I thought that really sent a message, and you know, I'm just hoping the message gets heard.
Well, well said. Anything I didn't ask that you feel like I should have?
No, nope. I appreciate your support. Believe it or not, everybody was tuning into LawNewz. I was when I was coming out on breaks, my client's family was on LawNewz. The other family was on LawNewz. Everybody was watching the program. You had great coverage, and we appreciated the constant updates. So thanks for your work.
Well, I will back you up just a half a step. I don't know as though what I did was necessarily support. I just sit here as a journalist and analyze and try to help people understand things like burden of proof. You know, why does the system work the way it does? So I perceive myself as more of an analyst and a purveyor of facts. If you took it that way, then I don't want people to get confused that there's a degree of detachment between me and you.
Oh yeah, I actually, you know, I don't think I'm referring to you folks so much. We were watching the comments. You know, the comments coming in. You could kind of watch the tide of the trial and how people were feeling about this by just the comments that were constantly flowing in, and that's what everybody kept checking. And it's funny, as the case progressed, we started to change some minds out there. Folks originally had it in their head that this was going to be a slam dunk for the state, but as the days progressed, we watch your commentators and your viewers talk about it. You know, it seemed to open some minds. So that gave us a sense that we were doing the right thing. But no, I get that you guys were very independent for this whole thing, so I appreciate you just doing the coverage for us.
All right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to give us a little bit of context in the case. Attorney Jon Sinn out of Ohio, we appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. You guys take